So let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Randy Wong. This is our monthly webinar for the treatment of floaters. Today is July 25th, 2017. And we are using the Demio platform for webinars, and it continues to change. And I think to date, hopefully, fingers crossed, I may actually have a seamless webinar tonight. So today we're going to do frequently questions that I get online. And this is, well, so much for seamless. This is the July webinar, not the June webinar. Sorry about that. I'm Randy Wong. I'm a retina specialist in Fairfax, Virginia. This is just outside of Washington, D.C. in the United States. If you'd like to follow me, please visit vitrectomyforfloaters.com or retinaeyedoctor.com. This webinar is for informational purposes only. This webinar does not offer medical advice, so nothing should be construed as medical advice. The information on this webinar is only offered for informational purposes. You should not act or rely on anything in this webinar or use it as a substitute for medical advice from a licensed professional. The content of this webinar may quickly become outdated, especially due to the nature of the topics covered, which are constantly evolving. The materials and the information on this webinar are not guaranteed to be correct, complete, or timely. Nothing in this webinar and nothing you or I do creates a doctor-patient relationship between you and the webinar, between you and me, or between you and Randall Wong MD or retinaeyedoctor.com or vitrectomyforfloaters.com. Even if you try to contact me through this posting of the webinar or conversations through the webinar, you are not creating a doctor-patient relationship. Although I am a doctor, I am not your doctor until and unless there is a written agreement specifically providing for a doctor-patient relationship. Okay, having gone through the disclaimers, what I want to talk about or go over are 4 questions that I frequently get online. And hopefully by then you'll have your own questions and we'll go through those. I'm assuming everyone can see the slides changing and can see me. I just need one of you to just affirm. Thanks. Oh, by the way, also online as a co-presenter is Chrissy McGargy. She's my coordinator for all my digital contacts. Some of you may have already corresponded with her. So one of the most common questions I get is, what replaces the vitreous during or after a vitrectomy? And on the right is a picture of the vitreous, even though it says posterior vitreous detachment. And what I want to tell you is that the vitreous is about 94% water. During the operation called an FOV or a vitrectomy, the vitreous is literally removed, and as it's being removed, BSS or balanced saline solution is pumped into the eye to replace the contents which are being removed, or the vitreous which is being removed. Within about 24 to 48 hours, the artificial BSS is replaced by your own aqueous humor. So definitely by 48 hours, all the artificial stuff that we've pumped in has been replaced by your own natural eye fluids. Keep in mind that the vitreous is not regenerated. So at the end of the day, after a vitrectomy is performed, the vitreous is removed and basically replaced by saline solution or your own natural saline solution. We don't need the vitreous once we're born. The vitreous is very integral to embryonic development, but once we're born, we really don't need it, and we don't know that it has any true function. Second question I get is, do I leave enough vitreous to protect the lens? I don't know, and it's not been proven that the vitreous has any specific function. It is hypothesized that it protects the lens from cataract formation because there is supposed oxygen consumption by the vitreous. It's not quite fair to say that one affects the other, meaning I don't think it's been proven in my mind that decreased oxygen in the vitreous protects the lens from becoming a cataract. In theory, it sounds nice, but it's never been proven. But it's hypothesized, and that's all we can say at this time. There are others that talk about leaving enough vitreous to protect the lens. And if you look at the arrows in the illustration, it's above those arrows or right in front of those areas where it would be very difficult to remove vitreous anyway. So I think, certainly in my experience, there's always some vitreous that is left there. It's very difficult to remove the vitreous which is attached or adherent to the back part of the lens. And that's what I'm trying to show you with the yellow arrows. In addition, it's even more difficult to accurately measure how much vitreous you're leaving. At the end of the day, the answer to the question is yes, vitreous is left there, mainly because, number one, it's difficult to see to remove. Number two, it's very difficult to remove even if you wanted to. So I think in most cases, there's always some vitreous there. And suffice it, we'll just leave it at that. When will I get a cataract after FOV? Well, as many of you know, it's been my experience that cataract formation can happen, but it's usually unlikely. The biggest question is, if there is a significant cataract at the time of operation, I think it's fair to assume that cataract formation may be advanced, but we don't really know, or accelerated might be a better word. Cataracts can occur, but in my experience, they usually do not. They certainly, or more likely, will occur if the lens is physically touched during an operation. And obviously, we do everything we can to avoid that. But I think the issue of cataract formation in vitrectomy is, in my opinion anyway, and in my experience, it's overblown. Chrissy, this is my little surprise for you. Do I need a driver? Well, it's hospital policy that you have a companion that's responsible for your welfare and can escort you out of the hospital. Now, they can escort you out of the hospital into a cab. They can drive you home, which is the usual situation, or for most of you, they would be driving you to the hotel. Perfect scenario is you come to town with a companion, but that adds to expense. The hospital is concerned about liability. And I, too, am concerned about my own liability, although I am guilty of driving patients to their hotel at times. Most recently, I've come into contact with a professional driving assistant who will personally take care of you. He does this for patients getting colonoscopies at surgical centers, not necessarily at Fairfax. So I have to iron out the details, but we're very, very close to solving this problem of getting a ride back to your hotel if you come from out of town. So what I'd like to do is open this up to, yeah, Chrissy, I think it's great news. Let's open this up to questions. If you have questions, go ahead and type them. I believe that everyone should be able to see the questions as they're typed. I'll read them and then go over them. Josh says, to the best of your recollection, what has been the youngest patient for an FOV, and how many FOVs have you done? At least 50. Yeah, I've probably done tens of thousands of vitrectomies. This is my 25th year of being a retinal surgeon. So I've certainly had more than adequate amount. I believe for about 5 or 6 years, I was one of the busiest retina surgeons in the state of Maryland as far as operating is concerned. I was doing all the retina for the two largest practices in the state of Maryland. The best of my recollection, the youngest patient on whom I've performed an FOV, I believe was 16 at the time. Mary wants to know, do you or will you start doing ultrasounds on the eye for seeing who are good candidates? Can you tell who has a PVD and who doesn't at the time of examination? I have an OCT scan showing I have partial. Would you still have to induce a PVD if this is the case? I don't know in what context you're asking about whether or not I would do an ultrasound. Maybe you can type in later for what purpose. I don't need an ultrasound to determine whether or not you've got a PVD. Most of the time I can determine if you've got a PVD in the office. And if there's any question at the time of operating, I have a different way to determine whether or not you've got a PVD, which is more definitive or easier than, say, an ultrasound. So if you're doing the ultrasound just to determine if you got a PVD, I don't routinely do it. I don't feel that there's a need for it. If you have an OCT showing that you've got a partial PVD, I would still want to complete it. So I would still have to induce a PVD. I think the biggest question I would have is, what age, how old are you? If you're at the age where you should normally have a PVD, it should not be a big deal at all. Elizabeth says, I'm 27 and have been dealing with floaters for 3 years. No PVD. I wouldn't expect you to have a PVD, by the way, at age 27. I'm back on. What has been your success with inducing PVD, no tears, no detachments? Do they happen a lot when inducing? Have any younger patients gotten cataracts soon after they were healthy? Wow. What's my success with inducing a PVD without tears? I think probably upwards of 90, 95%. And that's why I state that the chance of getting a tear with inducing a PVD is probably somewhere around 2 to 3%. If you do the math, there's an extra 2% one way or the other. I don't have the time or I don't have the capabilities of creating or keeping significant statistics. And I apologize for that. We're just not set up to do that. Do they happen a lot when inducing? No, they don't happen very often, but I think they might happen more often, and that's where we get the 2 to 3% of the time with younger patients. Cataracts are, in my recollection, we've had a few, maybe 2 or 3 younger patients get cataracts, and in each situation, these patients were having their second or third vitrectomy for whatever reason. And every time you do an additional vitrectomy, you have to get a little bit more aggressive. And one of the corollaries to that is the more aggressive you are trying to get more vitreous, the closer you've got to get to the lens. And if you touch it, it's possible to get a significant cataract. So I think that's happened probably 2 to 3 times in the last 4 or 5 years. I generally do not see patients much after several months, or I lose contact, I should say. Most patients come in, operate, and then go back to their own doctor. I'm not aware that there's a significant cataract issue. And again, I think it's really kind of overblown. One of the things that I would caution you is that there are so many factors that we don't understand leading to cataract formation. One of them may indeed be, oxygenation in the vitreous. It may be how much vitreous is adherent to the lens. It may be operating time. We just really don't know. Mr. Suman says, can I please visit South Asia? I would love to. And maybe you can help me set that up in the future. As I get older, I realize I need to travel more. Josh says, how did the 16-year-old do? Well, both of them did very, very well as far as I know. One was from upstate New York. Second was from Florida. Elizabeth says, have I heard of a hypersonic vitrector that introduces the concept of liquification compared to the guillotine cutter, which is, I think, what you're saying. The hypersonic vitrector liquefies and aspirates the vitreous. I'm not aware that it is available for use. And I certainly don't have any experience with it. But yes, I have heard of it. Mary asks, any detachments or holes when doing FOV? Well, about 1 to 2% of the time you may get a tear, certainly no holes. You almost never, I don't think I've ever had a retinal detachment occur while I'm operating. The concern is what happens after the operation. Was there a small tear that was created by the operation, or did it happen after the operation leading to a retinal detachment? So one of the concerns in your postoperative period is we want to make sure that you do not develop a retinal detachment after the surgery is completed. Josh says, I had crosslinking done for my keratoconus and I am healed. How long should I wait to do the surgery? Any new thoughts on the 27 gauge? I'm not particularly concerned about the keratoconus as long as it's clear so I can see through it. If you're healed, I don't think there should be any reason you need to wait nor any concern that the vitrectomy is going to affect your results with the crosslinking. I don't have any new thoughts on the 27 gauge other than the fact that the company is still eager to roll it out, but I think the 25 gauge is so popular, and I don't think the 27 gauge necessarily adds that much advantage, which is why it's so slow to being adopted. Mary says, has detachment occurred after with any patients? Well, detachments can occur with any eye surgery, not even vitrectomy, cataract surgery, etc. I have certainly had patients develop retinal detachments after vitrectomy, and the rate is probably somewhere around 1%, maybe 2%, if you take all the patients that I've operated on. It may actually be less. Again, statistics are hard to keep, or at least hard for us to keep. But in general, it doesn't happen very often. Elizabeth asks, how successful is lasering? And we use a laser a lot or very often in ophthalmology. I'm assuming that you're asking about the YAG laser for vitreolysis. Can you confirm that? The YAG laser has been used by a few people in ophthalmology. It's being promoted by a YAG laser company. I'm not aware of any retina specialist that prefers this. I know I do not, so I do not perform it, so I can't speak to any experience whatsoever, and I can't speak for anyone that who does that. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that it would be effective. I'm certain that it has worked before. I just have no experience. It doesn't seem, I think, to a retina specialist, it's not the safest way to proceed. Mr. Suman says, if you visit South Asia quickly, then we, who are suffering from floaters, will be relieved. Please at least make a schedule. I'm from Bangladesh. Thank you very much for the invitation. Josh says, I'm very myopic due to keratoconus. I assume that's what KC is. Is it the size of the eye when I was born that affects chances of tears, or now with the disease? I would say it's the former. It's the size of the eye when you were born. You are more nearsighted now only because or due to the change in the shape of your cornea, making you more nearsighted. But the definition of myopia in most cases is the distance from the surface of the cornea to the surface of the retina, so that the larger the eye, the more nearsighted. In special situations where there are aberrations in the shape of the cornea, such as in keratoconus, you get a secondary myopia, but it doesn't change the size of the eye, and therefore it doesn't increase the chance of tears. Elizabeth said, I'm sorry, that was the ballpark answer of how many FOVs you have done. The range. So FOV it stands for floater-only vitrectomy, and I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that I've probably done upwards of 10 to 20,000 vitrectomies, which are the same thing, but for all indications. So I've just never been able to break it down. And again, because we just don't, it's not my habit to keep track. I don't know how many retinal detachments I've done. I don't know how many macular puckers I've done. I don't know how many floater vitrectomies I've done, etc. But the basic mechanism, the vitrectomy, is absolutely the same across the board. So for the operation that you would need, I've done probably upwards of 20, close to 20,000. Mr. Suman says, I think so many requests to visit Southeast Asia as I've seen on your different address. It's so tough and needs so many worth to visit the USA. You know, operating in a different country gets tricky, but if I were ever to come there, we'd have to get permission for me to act as a doctor. I know it can be done. I don't know the process. Elizabeth says, how long have I been doing FOVs? Probably as long as you've been able to follow me. Let's just say 6, 7, 8 years. Mr. Suman says, as we are living lower than the USA, but we can able to get treatment. Mary says, does Kenalog help in inducing better than anything else? Kenalog is a visualization tool. It doesn't actually make the separation of the vitreous from the retina any easier or more difficult, but it's easier for me to see what the vitreous is doing. So the Kenalog is a suspension, meaning it's got particles in it. Suspension versus solution. Most drugs are in liquid form or solutions. The medicine's actually dissolved in the liquid. Kenalog is a suspension, and it has lots of fine particles. And so those particles get hung up in the vitreous, so it kind of stains the vitreous, so I can see where the vitreous is and I can see how it's behaving. Mr. Suman says, thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending this webinar and contributing and for following us. Josh says, if detachment were to happen, when does that usually take place? It usually takes place within the first 6 to 12 weeks after surgery. Thank you, Mr. Suman, who says that you like my ethics. Mary says, does sutures help regulate the pressure better? I'm worried about pressure and swelling. Sutures don't really regulate, they just prevent. I generally use sutures on patients who I otherwise won't be able to see after the first day of surgery. So if you're from out of town, I prefer to use sutures. About 1/3 of patients with 25 gauge have a low pressure the next morning. I generally use sutures to avoid that, so that's one small issue that we don't have to deal with. I don't know what swelling you're talking about. Usually there's very little or no swelling, at least on the outside of the eye, and we generally don't have swelling anywhere else. Elizabeth says, do you ever think there will be an injectable drug or drop? I assume what you're saying is to get floaters to go away. There might be. I don't think there's much, there's a big market, or I don't think that there's a lot of research money going into it. There was a drug that has been since discontinued, which helped increase the likelihood of a PVD, but I think we all felt that it didn't really have much place in what we do. Have I done an FOV? Josh Ash, have I done an FOV on a patient with corneal transplants? Yes, I have. The issue with corneal transplants are that it has to be a corneal transplant which is clear enough for me to see into the vitreous. That's the only influence or concern I would have with a corneal transplant. Mary says, what are the chances of macular edema? It's a difficult question. The answer is I think it's going to vary from surgeon to surgeon. It's been my experience that it rarely, if ever, has happened in the last 25 years. Why don't we just take a couple more questions and then we'll finish up for tonight. Elizabeth says, will you keep us updated on that hypersonic liquefaction device? Also, if a retractor is sucking and cutting, how is not pulling? Well, if it's cutting as fast as it's sucking at a rate of thousands of times per minute, it's almost impossible to pull. And that's why the cut rate is so high. But it's very intuitive. If it were slower, I could see how if you're sucking, you would also be pulling on tissue. But that's a very good, and that's one reason that 25 gauge was revolutionary, because the cut rate compared to the 20 gauge is much faster. I will do my best to keep you updated, at least on the website, about any significant news about hypersonic liquefaction. I can't really keep up to date with things that are still experimental. I do get updates on new instruments. There are always companies trying to break through with new technology. And the timing it takes a long time to bring new technology into the market, 5 to 10 years sometimes. So it's hard to keep up to date without a lot of hard research, knowing whether or not a company that is coming up with a new technology is still viable. Many times funds run out and the companies disappear, and so does the technology. Josh says, thank you. Josh, thank you for participating. Mary, I know the VMR Institute, and I don't know how they practice. I know that Dr. Sabag publishes a lot, but I can't make any remark as to their capabilities as physicians. I know that they are in California, probably in the Newport Beach or maybe Huntington Beach area. Mary says, thank you, and I thank you in return. Well, thank you all for joining in tonight. I'm going to try and get this published as soon as I can. Chrissy wants to make sure that I give you her email address, which is right here. It's rwongcm13@gmail. Chrissy can help you with insurance information, discuss to you about driver recommendations, scheduling surgery, and medical clearance. She will also help you schedule an appointment with me at one of my 2 offices. Well, I'm Randy Wong. I'm a retina specialist in Northern Virginia. Thank you so much for participating. We're going to do this again next month. Hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks again, Chrissy. Appreciate your help. Elizabeth, thank you.